You're listening to the Connection Care Community Podcast, a podcast designed to help you understand your body more deeply and feel more confident navigating your hormones, cycle, and fertility. Each episode offers grounded, research-informed guidance and integrative tools to support hormone health, embodied awareness, and informed choice. If you're seeking clarity, connection, and a more trusting relationship with your body, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Here's your host, the founder of Connection Care Therapy, Majida.
Hello and welcome to the Connection Care Community Podcast. My name is Majida, and today we'll be chatting about something that I believe changes the way that we understand emotional well-being, especially for those of us who have menstrual cycles. I want to start with an experience that many of us have had at some point in time, but maybe haven't been able to name or have the language for. So if you can take a moment to imagine with me, and you probably don't actually have to imagine because you likely have had this experience at some point in time if you menstruate, but let's just play for a moment, right? So imagine you're going through a stretch where you feel capable, you feel relatively patient, you feel like yourself, or at least a version of yourself that feels familiar, that you recognize, that feels steady. And then a week or two later, something shifts. You notice that your anxiety is higher, or maybe your threshold for stress or for patience drops. You're more irritable. It's like things are suddenly too much. And if we're not aware of what's happening hormonally, the easy, obvious, even sometimes logical explanation seems to be something's wrong with me. And it's that conclusion, that one right there, the one that lands on personal failure or emotional instability, that's the one that I want to push back on today. So let's talk about mental health, right? Mental health oftentimes is discussed as if emotional regulation, resilience, or focus, patience, that those things should remain completely steady regardless of context or what's happening with us in terms of our physiology. And for people, right, those of us with menstrual cycles, that framing just simply does not reflect what's actually happening in our bodies. Stress tolerance naturally shifts throughout the month. Our concentration shifts, our capacity for patience and connection shifts, our sleep quality shifts. And those fluctuations aren't just random or signs of dysregulation. They are oftentimes reflections of pretty predictable neurobiological processes that shape estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, as well as the ongoing communication between our reproductive system and our nervous system. So this is big for me, right? During my time getting my master's degree in clinical mental health studies, I did a lot of deep dives into this area during my time at Northwestern. It was really what I was passionate about, what a big part of my time, if I had papers and research, I would dive into the topic of integrative mental health and fertility, specifically the intersection of emotional well-being and reproductive psychology. What became clear, both academically as well as from my own personal lived experiences, is that mental health and hormonal health are not separate conversations. They are deeply, deeply interdependent systems that are in constant communication with each other. However, in the field that I got my degree in, right, in the mental health field, these two conversations are still largely treated as if they are completely disconnected from one another. And that's a gap that I want to take some time to bridge today. So for those of you who have listened to this podcast before, you're likely somewhat familiar at this point with the phases and stages of our menstrual cycle, right? But if you're new here, just a brief overview is that starting with your menstruation all the way through ovulation, that's your follicular phase, right? So it houses both menstruation and ovulation. And then we go into our luteal phase after ovulation occurs. So starting in the follicular phase, we'll talk about menstruation at the end, but we'll start, let's post menstruation in the follicular phase. We start to see, right, estrogen is steadily rising during that time. And estrogen, many of us know estrogen from like reproduction stuff, right? Maybe perimenopausal or menopausal stuff. But we are oftentimes not talking about estrogen and its impact on our mental well-being. Estrogen directly influences neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, also GABA, right? It's what's called neuroprotective, which means that it supports neuroplasticity, it buffers stress. This is why so many of us experience improved moods during certain stages of our cycles, right? Increased motivation, greater cognitive flexibility during this phase. It's not necessarily because things are better externally, but because we have the neurochemical environment that is genuinely more supportive. And then we go into ovulation, which one of the things that allows for ovulation to occur is this peak, this rise in estrogen. And then also testosterone comes into play around that time. And many of us might be like, oh, testosterone and those who menstruate. But yeah, testosterone is responsible for libido and for our ability to maintain muscle integrity and equality even. Testosterone is also big when it comes to confidence. We got more communication around our ovulatory time, and social engagement might feel more natural. A lot of this can have to do with our brain being primed for a more outward focus and connection. And then we get into our luteal phase, right? So ovulation has occurred, and now we're in our luteal phase. And this is where many who menstruate report a fair amount of distress, right? If that's the experience that they're having, then the luteal phase can really prime us for that experience. So what's going on in the luteal phase? We have progesterone becoming dominant, and then progesterone has this metabolite called allopregnanolone, which interacts with GABA receptors. It can be this experience, right? This natural hormonal shift for some can be very calming in certain contexts. However, it can also increase stress sensitivity when levels are fluctuating. Sleep architecture can also change, right? GABA and sleep are very intimately connected. And so we can see some shifts in that during this part of our cycle. And here's the one that really, in my strong opinion, doesn't get enough attention. Progesterone increases has a big impact on insulin resistance and the potential of insulin resistance, which means that blood sugar can become for some more volatile during the second half of our cycle. Why does that matter? Because when we experience things like glucose crashing, that can show up as anxiety, irritability, brain fog. So what feels like an emotional response may actually have a significant metabolic component. And things like eating patterns that may have been fine, right, worked for us during the first part of our cycle may not be sufficient to support us in stabilizing our mood during our luteal phase. So last but not least, we're going to talk about menstruation, which menstruation is actually part of the follicular phase, but we'll chat about it here at the end because this can be a pretty big time for many of us who menstruate. Because during menstruation, both estrogen and progesterone, to restart our cycles, right, reboot the entire system, both estrogen and progesterone drop. And with that drop, we can have things like certain inflammation markers can increase during that time. And this inflammatory shift can directly influence our mood, our energy, as well as our pain perception. So many people notice that there is a natural pull inward, right? Both during the luteal phase and also into menstruation, that there can be a desire for quiet during this phase, that you may feel less social or less motivated or more interior, right? More focused inward. And that's not something to pathologize. It's actually a biological pull towards restoration and repair and rebooting. So the point of all of this is not to reduce our mood to our hormones, right? That's the last thing that I would be a proponent of. But it is to start to establish what we experience emotionally is at least partially a product of where we are at in our cycles. And that when we understand that natural connection, that the self-judgment that tends to accumulate over the years of why am I like this? Or, oh gosh, the things that are said by members of our community, maybe family members or people at school or partners, right? Things that are said that really influence that self-judgment. Well, that has somewhere else to go when we understand this, when we are more cycle literate. So despite this growing awareness that hormones have an influence on our mood, what I've seen in the mental health space is that there is still oftentimes operates, right? There is a idea that there is a separation between what is going on in our bodies. And so like the brain exists completely independent from the endocrine system, which is the complete opposite of what is actually true, right? What I've seen is situations where anxiety may be diagnosed without even evaluating something like thyroid function. What I've seen is where depression may be treated without properly assessing something like iron levels or blood sugar stability. Mood symptoms may be managed without asking whether the body has the actual metabolic foundation that is required for us to experience proper emotional regulation. And it's this gap that led me to develop what I call rooted recovery, which is a framework that I use both in private practice as well as in training other practitioners. The core principles of this framework is that before assuming a psychological origin for mood symptoms, we ask whether the nervous system is responding to physiological strain. Right? We investigate what is happening with the whole person because both can be true. But skipping the physiological question means treating symptoms in isolation from the conditions that may actually be generating them. PMDD is a condition that makes this especially visible. So what research is consistently showing is that hormone levels in PMDD are typically within normal ranges. So the issue isn't that there's too much or too little of any particular hormone. It's that the brain is maybe unusually sensitive to the cyclical fluctuations, particularly to the changes in allopregnanolone. Remember that progesterone metabolite that I mentioned earlier. So mood symptoms aren't irrational, right? They're neurobiological reactions to what can be predictable biochemical shifts, but without addressing the physiological terrain, things like blood sugar stability or nutrient sufficiency, inflammation, gut health issues, right? Stress load. This treatment tends to default to suppression, which looks like managing the symptoms without actually asking the essential question of what is driving the symptoms. And that pattern extends well beyond PMDD, right? It is pretty common wherever mood symptoms are present. So I want to talk about two places that this really shows up quite often, the postpartum time period, as well as I want to go a little bit deeper into thyroid health because that's a big one. So let's start out with postpartum, right? The hormonal transition that's going on after birth is truly one of the most, like hear me when I say the most dramatic experiences that a human physiology can go through. So if you're in that time frame and you're navigating this experience of postpartum and you are like, what am I? Who am I? Where am I? What is happening to my system? Know that you are truly in the midst of one of the most just one of the most phenomenal experiences that a human body can go through. So to kind of frame it up a little bit, right? We had talked about when estrogen and progesterone drops during the menstrual cycle. Like, we got a big old drop during postpartum, like way bigger than than the human body is like going to experience at any other point in time. So estrogen and progesterone are dropping rapidly. We have sleep deprivation, which is a common natural aspect of having a little one in our world, right? Sleep deprivation can compound that strain. And then iron deficiency is not uncommon for those who are in postpartum. The body, the little one that you have you've just grown in your body will take what it needs to take across the board, right? So we got iron deficiency as a potential. Thyroid shifts are big, adrenal depletion. And then it's not uncommon for unprocessed relational stress to also intensify all of what's going on during this transition. Medication and therapy can absolutely be supportive in this context. And I want to be clear about this, right? Without diminishing the impact of conventional medical supports, and absolutely seek support if you're navigating experiences that are outside of the realm of typical, right? For sure. And I also want to be clear that it's important to ensure that we are assessing our metabolic terrain as well, that we're asking what could be happening with a system, right, that is physiologically depleted, and how can we actually support that system to regulate, and ensuring that that system has the resources that it needs to regulate. Right? When we're talking about blood sugar regulation, making sure that micronutrients are in place to ensure that the adrenals and the thyroid and all of these iron is coming back online, right, properly. So that leads me into talking more deeply about thyroid dysfunction, because that connects to all kinds of things, including blood sugar instability, chronic inflammation, right? All of these other categories that can really get missed. Anxiety, depression, brain fog, irritability, all of these can actually have a root in our thyroid health and in our overall metabolic picture. However, if they can oftentimes, right, we're dealing with something that is anxiety related, brain fog related, and if it only gets addressed as a mood condition instead of really addressing the potential physiological root, then a lot's going to get missed, right? A lot's going to get missed. So the goal, just to summarize, the goal is not one means over the other. I function under an integrative model of care. It's not replacing, right, psychological care, but it's also saying, let's ensure that psychological care and support is not just happening in a vacuum, because we as humans in our bodies don't just exist in a vacuum. Okay? So mental health, hormone health. I also want to talk about stress a bit in this conversation today, and get into a little bit around trauma as well. Mental health and hormones become very difficult to separate when you look at chronic stress. The stress response system is where it's important to spend a little bit of time here, because this is kind of what I will call a hinge point, right? So the HPA axis, right, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, this is our stress response system. It shares regulatory pathways, interestingly enough, with what's called our HPO axis, our hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. Our HPO axis is what governs our menstrual cycle. So stress response system and the system that governs our menstrual cycles are deeply interconnected. So when something like cortisol becomes chronically elevated, it can interfere with progesterone production and the signaling that's actually required for ovulation. In other of my Substacks and podcasts, I've talked about how the impact of stress can shorten a menstrual cycle or cause it to become unpredictable or even lengthen, right? Depending on what's going on with that particular body and that particular physiology. But the takeaway is that our menstrual cycle is very, very responsive to stress because this HPA axis, the stress response system, is deeply interconnected with the HPO axis, which governs our menstrual cycle. I experienced this directly when I was dealing with prolonged stress, adrenal depletion, the adrenal depletion eventually led to gut health dysfunction that included an H. pylori diagnosis, and the gut disruption affected my ability to absorb nutrients properly, which then affected my immune system balance, which then impacted my hormone production and metabolism. And emotional regulation was almost impossible around that time. It was really, really hard. And obviously not because I lacked the ability to have coping skills or insight, but because my system did not have the physiological reserves to buffer stress the way that it needed to. And that's the important thing that I want to name clearly, very clearly, that you could have a very strong therapeutic mind-body support practice. You can have solid self-awareness. You can have a consistent meditation habit, and you can still find your nervous system deeply struggling. If blood sugar is unstable, if inflammation is elevated, if your hormones are dysregulated, those are not competing explanations, right? They are connected explanations to what is going on with your overall system. So to go a little bit into trauma, and this is an area that I want to address carefully because it comes up often and it carries a fair amount of potency to it. In my practice, I focus on reproductive trauma and its physiological impact. And what I have seen is consistency in the research around these topics and conversations, that chronic or relational trauma and stress can impact our reproductive system and reproductive outcomes. So conditions like fibroids, endometriosis, PCOS tend to appear in the research at higher rates with people who have trauma histories. The mechanism isn't completely mysterious. Remember what I just said about the HPA axis? All right, the trauma dysregulates our stress axis, and that can impact things like systemic inflammation or immune function or the gut microbiome, all of which influence hormone metabolism over time. So what this means practically is that if someone's baseline stress reactivity is already elevated from years of unresolved trauma, the natural dip in stress tolerance that occurs during parts in our cycle can feel very amplified in ways that are genuinely destabilizing. And what I have found in working with my clients the way that I do is that cycle awareness is a deeply valuable tool in this context, not because it's some kind of a rigid framework, but because it gives us context. Right? Knowing that there are certain weeks where we carry less bandwidth allows for us to adjust expectations and ideally be able to moderate our experience so that we are more supported during those stages of our cycle. It allows for, as I was saying, adjusted expectations rather than forming some kind of a conclusion that something is fundamentally or permanently wrong with us. A couple of other things that I want to talk about is the gut. Right, I talked about the gut earlier one and also shared a little bit about my experience, but the gut is really underrepresented in mental health conversation. As I shared, the gut microbiome influences estrogen metabolism and serotonin production and inflammatory tone and nutrient absorption and so much more. So when the gut is compromised through whether it's chronic stress or infection or antibiotic use or long-term inflammation, there can be a ripple effect that moves throughout our entire system, that then our cycle regularity as well as mood are impacted. So big takeaway from this: remember, the gut produces a significant portion of your body's serotonin. It communicates directly with the brain through the vagus nerve, and it plays a massive role in whether estrogen gets cleared from the body or gets recirculated. All of these things impact our mental health and mental well-being, and it's why I have a whole series that is going to come out on Substack, where I talk about gut and brain and hormone connection in just much more deep detail. So if this is resonating with you, please look out for that series. Last but not least, I want to briefly touch on hormonal birth control. I go much more deeper into this on my Substack, but know that hormonal contraceptives are almost always discussed in terms of pregnancy prevention or in terms of us regulating one's cycle. And it's important to know, I have a whole series on hormonal contraceptions on my podcast and Substack, where I deep dive much more into this. But just to get into what we're talking about in terms of what this means for our mental health, is that synthetic hormones affect our neurotransmitter pathways. It impacts serotonin and dopamine and GABA, and can alter our stress physiology in ways that may vary significantly from one person to another. Know that there are some large population studies there out in the world that have found associations between hormonal contraception use and higher rates of antidepressant prescriptions, particularly amongst adolescents and young adults. Some people experience what we call emotional blunting, or also increased anxiety when they are exposed to hormonal contraceptives, while there are others who actually feel more emotionally stable on hormonal birth control. The nervous system responds in deeply individual ways. However, one of the things that I want to point out is that there is some evidence and research that shows that hormonal contraceptives can deplete certain kinds of nutrients over time, specifically those, the B vitamins, the ones that are connected to neurotransmitter synthesis and stress regulation. So it's not me advocating whether or not I believe in full body sovereignty. That's one of the core principles, ethical principles of my work and my paradigm as a practitioner. And I also believe in informed consent, right? And so none of this is a reason to say whether or not you use them, but it is a reason to become educated, right, about the impact, and to understand how you may be able to navigate supporting your system if hormonal contraceptions are part of your story. As I said, I go much deeper into this on my Substack and other podcasts. I also have a blog called What Every Woman Should Know About the Pill over on my website. So be sure to check those out if you want to go deeper into the conversation around hormonal contraception. So I want to be clear about something before I close out for today. Cycle awareness is genuinely very, very powerful. However, I do not believe that it is a substitute for clinical care. If you are experiencing severe mood symptoms, if suicidal ideation or panic attacks, or you're experiencing anything that is significantly impairing your daily function, please, please, please reach out to a professional. The integrative lens that I'm describing is not meant to replace clinical care, right? It's meant to complement clinical care. Understanding the physiology doesn't mean that we just put our heads down and push on through symptoms that require more direct support. What it does mean is that having information when you do seek out that support allows you to be able to ask better questions of the people who are responsible for supporting you in your care. So with that being said, if you want to go deeper, I have a robust free resource library over on my website with tools around cycle syncing and hormone health and integrative support. I also will be launching my cycle connection course soon. I've been very busy with my private clients, so I have not gotten around to launching that, but that is a big thing that will be out some point in the near future. So if you're looking for more of a structured format, weaving together cycle awareness and nervous system regulation, conversations around gut health and menstrual health and hormonal physiology, that is going to be a really, really powerful resource. I also have a blog called Mental Health and the Menstrual Cycle, Connecting Fam and Mental Wellness, which is a really great place to go next. You can find that over all my links on my website, of course, and links on my Substack. The article is on my website and then links on my Substack. In closing, the experience of feeling like your emotional life is unpredictable or unmanageable is very hard. As someone who has been there, I can say from a very deeply empathetic place that I know how hard it can be, especially if you've had to handle this while being labeled, anxious or sensitive or overly emotional. Our biology oftentimes tells a very different story, and it can tell a story where we are navigating these fluctuations in a way that is grounded in logic and some level of predictability, where the difficult weeks are difficult for a reason, and that there's a physiological answer around that conversation. So when I believe when we understand that we can start living in a deeper support with our system, right? But that's all that I have for today. This has been a longer one. It's a topic I'm obviously very deeply passionate about and have a lot to share around. But we'll stop there for today. I really, really do appreciate you being here and for navigating this experience and this journey with me. So until next time, I look forward to our next conversation. And until then, be sure to stay connected.
That does it for this episode of the Connection Care Community Podcast with Majida. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you're leaving with a fresh perspective on your body and overall well-being, along with practical tools you can integrate into daily life. The support doesn't stop here. Be sure to connect with us online at connectioncaretherapy.com for more resources to guide you on your journey. You can also find us on Substack and connect with Majida on Instagram at Majida Sai'da. Remember to rate, review, and share this podcast. And most importantly, stay connected.